So it's a great pleasure and also a great honor to have Patrick Scallon here on stage. Since 2008, Mr. Scallon is the communications director at Dries Van Noten. And before Dries Van Noten, he worked at Maison Martin Margiela. And in the 17 years at Margiela, his role evolved from press relations and sample box packer into communications director and eventually artistic director of communications. And in a rapidly changing fashion world, I think Mr. Scallon, with all his years of experience, sees himself falling into the elder statesman role, as he described it beautifully.
He said jokingly, but anyway.
In the Irish Times. Now, both the fashion houses on the resume of Mr. Scallon, Patrick, have a very special and a rare characteristic. Before Renzo Rosso, the owner of Diesel, bought Maison Margiela, it was an independent fashion house, and today Dries Van Noten still is an independent fashion house. So, but Patrick, you didn't study fashion. You started out elsewhere. You even did an internship at the European Commission. But were you interested in clothes when you came into the fashion world?
Before I answer, there's just one thing I want to say. What I'm saying here is very personal, and okay. It's a great honor to be invited and to be here. I love the fact that we've been invited, and I want to thank the FFI for the invitation. I'm not Belgian, I'm Irish. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, having lived in Brussels for 10 years, I've also worked with Belgian designers quite a lot. Okay. Without being too dealing with the past, I ended up working in fashion because a friend of mine married a Belgian girl called Manouche Koormans, who was a friend of Sophie Pay, who actually works here. Mm-hmm. And Sophie is the daughter of Jenny Merens, who is the partner of Martin Margiela.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So between them, they wanted to find a way of us meeting, and that I would meet Jenny. And actually, the only time that could happen was at the wedding of this person, these two friends. Mm-hmm. So we met, and we had a very vibrant conversation, which was almost an argument. And from that moment, 3 weeks later, I was asked to go and help them sell the collection because they needed somebody to sell the collection in English. I thought I was incredibly good at selling collection. Apparently, I was awful because I made everyone go page by page. Okay. So I ended up working there for a long, long time. So 3 weeks became 3 months because they wanted to have a lady do the job. So I'm here giving my views on things because a lot of what we do today is instinctual and is instinctive. Yeah. So I don't see myself as an expert. Mm. But I've had a lot of experience, and I think that a lot of what we do is something about a gut feeling, and it's about an alchemy between the people that you're working for and why you're doing what you're doing. Mm-hmm. That goes back to what was said this morning, which is extremely important. Yeah. So I think part of me wanted to do this, but also within my family situation, my mother was always interested in clothes, and like a good Irish Catholic gay son, I was quite interested in my mother's wardrobe, but not putting it on, just actually looking at it. And also, strangely also, my father was always completely obsessive about clothing. For example, he was very lucky that from the age of, and even to this day, from the age of 23, he has a winter suit made 1 year and a summer suit made the next. Okay. And when I was a kid, we used to go to Dublin, and there was a tailor in Stephen's Green in Dublin called Monaghan. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing as a child going in there is you'd go into the atelier when they were cutting the cloth and making the suits, is that it was complete silence, because this man, he had an atelier, he made the suits for the Prime Minister and lots of people, but everyone in his atelier were deaf and dumb. Okay. And I can remember as a child having that experience of seeing that he would train these people who weren't often integrated into society at that time. We're talking about, I think he started this in the late 40s, early 50s. He retired a long time ago already. So that whole fascinating and seeing the way clothes were made. Yeah. And just by chance, my brother also works in Milan in fashion. So we were sort of imbued with that from an early age.
Mm-hmm. I guess there's also, I saw a picture popping up. I think,
Oh, yes.
Yeah, you wanted to say something about this.
This, I think Belgian people recognize as stoofvlees. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. And where we work is across the canal, just over here, Dries's offices. And we had the great pleasure of having this for lunch last week. So I'm quite proud of the fact that I work in communications. We're dealing with image all of the time. We're very clever people. We tell other people what they should be doing, etc. So I was doing simple food porn. I put it on my Instagram. I try not to put a lot of food on my Instagram because it gives you a bad reputation. But I put it up, and what happened was, 2 days later, somebody just put on my Instagram. I think it's a very good image for creativity, because creative people sometimes see what we all see, but just in a different way, and it's a spark. And once that spark happens, and you share that spark, other people can't look at it in the same way ever again. Yeah. So somebody on my Instagram, 2 days later, put, "I see a rabbit."
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, I can't see stoofvlees anymore. So in a way, I think that's a good analogy for what we do. I think our job is to actually capture that spark, almost put lightning in a bottle, and make that palatable to people. And I think that comes from passion, that comes from bloody-mindedness, that comes from confidence, that comes from doubt, fear, lots of things. Passion and fun. I think fun is really important, and I think it's something that we're missing. I think as an industry, we don't laugh at ourselves half enough. We've become far too serious, etc. So that's why the stoofvlees is there, by the way. Just not. I know that you've only had sandwiches for lunch, but okay.
If we go back now to your job at Dries Van Noten, how would you describe your communication strategy? And I know it's a very broad question, and maybe we can break it down in multiple components. Maybe starting with fashion shows, because at Dries Van Noten, the house is known for beautiful fashion shows, and there goes a lot of effort in it. How do you see it? And
oh, this is a very wide thing, and as you probably gathered already, I ramble a lot, so
okay.
It's just a question of getting around it. I think, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be working with somebody who is, this isn't what we say in the industry, press speak. Dries is on fire at the moment, and I think it's a wonderful thing to see that somebody evolves and strengthens in their vision and in their craft, and still has an incredible joy in his love of fabrics and his love of prints and his love of actually being the person he is today in the industry. And I think that's something that's really great when you see that Dries is becoming very good at being Dries Van Noten, actually. And I think that's a great thing when people have that confidence. I think that Dries also is somebody who is, it's a cliche in the industry to say a storyteller. I think his world is a very complete world. I mean, some people might think it's a little bit removed, a little elitist, but yet there are so many things that are completely within that contradict, but also complement each other. So when you go into a Dries store, or shop rather, it's very close to what his home is like. When you see what his love of clothes are, that's very communicable through the experience of the shop. And also his love of fabrics, etc. So I think that the fashion shows also became another way of Dries welcoming people into his world. And it's a shared passion, and it remains passionate. So because we're still a company, because there's a lot of talk today. By the way, this is a parenthesis. I think today we're sharing a lot of ideas, but I don't want it to seem like we're preaching at you, because often what we're telling you today could be the precise thing that you shouldn't do, and you should be going literally the opposite direction. I think it depends on what the generation. So I don't want this to seem like I'm pontificating, but I think that in the world today, there's a much more of a Cartesian approach to how you make something creative, a commodity that's predictable and quantifiable.
And in the fashion
And
shows,
Dries, we're not like that.
in the fashion shows you organize, isn't there a danger that if you make like really a big show element that people don't have the time to look at the collection so much?
Well, that is the danger, and I think that might have been the case with Dries at one time, but I think that's starting to change again. I think we're sort of living a full circle moment, and things are going back to where they were at a certain time. You know, there's a lot of talk amongst, I mean, it's a shame that people who do what I do in other houses, we don't get together more to speak to each other, but there is this idea, which is quite patronizing possibly, that people are only capable of absorbing one message per experience. So you have to choose between a collection and a show, or an emotion and a knowledge of what the designer is trying to say. So I think sometimes, yes, in this Instagram world, if you create too much noise around the collection or too much message in one experience, people don't know where to put their attention.
And talking about Instagram, I know at Dries Van Noten you are very cautious about the use of social media. And I see other fashion brands using a lot of it. Social media has become like inevitable. How do you handle this at Dries Van Noten?
It's a little bit tough because somebody mentioned, I think it might have been Tom Barman today, about that idea of dad dancing. You know, I think you have to be a little bit careful that whatever you're doing is intrinsic to who you are and it feels right, and then you're not just doing it to do it. And I think that's also part of owning your generation and owning who you are within the plethora of what the industry is. I mean, I think sometimes when you see designers trying to be hip with the young'uns, it can become a little bit incongruous and weird. But yet, I think with us, we've been extremely cautious with it. It still remains as instinctive as the other things that we choose to do, but it's something that we're not doing just to do it. Because I think today, we're under a lot of pressure to be as big as we possibly can. Often, I think it's better to focus on being as big as we would like to be in order to function in a way that's interesting for us and challenging and nourishing for the people who follow us and like what we're doing.
And also, there is a lot of pressure. In fashion, it's all about celebrities and coming to fashion shows, wearing at Oscar night. How do you deal with this?
Well, again, this is a very big subject that I have maybe very idiosyncratic views on. It's interesting because today our industry is considered that we run after celebrity and we're almost like magpies. We have to chase what shines. For us, and at least for me and how I approach it, I think that it's completely okay for us to have creative peers that we admire, whose work we admire, who come from another field, that we're happy to work with or we're happy to dress. And that it's not just that you're hopping onto a bandwagon of celebrity and because somebody has a lot of likes or hits on Instagram or whatever, that you're jumping on it. Because that's another issue that we have at fashion shows. For example, scenario. Somebody contacts you, they want to come to the show, and they will say, by the way, we've packed all of our Dries Van Noten, and we'd like to wear that to the show. What happens often is when they come to the show, they're photographed. The assumption is that we've paid them to wear it. That's because that's the basic line. People assume that our industry is such that we want the maximum of exposure all of the time. So sometimes you actually say, you know what, maybe wear the Dries clothes to somebody else's show and wear whatever you want, because we don't want people to think that we're dressing people just to have visibility. So what we tend to do is dress people that we feel are intriguing to us as creative peers, but also people who want to wear us. We don't approach people and ask them to wear us. What we do is we're happy to dress people who come to us and ask. Or come to Dries and ask, rather.
And another thing of your communication is you don't advertise. And you can say that's a budget question, but it's also a strategic question. Can you explain that?
Well, I think a lot of strategy, I think a lot of good strategy comes from the lack of budget. So often we post-rationalize things. So in a way, people will say to you, you have a strategy of not advertising. Of course we do, it's just that we couldn't afford it. So, but yet we pretend it's a strategy often. I think advertising is quite weird for a company like us. And if any of you are going to go into the PR advertising thing, I think I share what my view has been, is that it's sort of like being a little bit pregnant. You cannot be a little bit pregnant. You're either there or you're not. And I can remember working with Martin Margiela when he was working with Hermes and sitting at meetings, and they were saying to each other, but we're a small advertiser. But yet in my head, I was thinking, but I see your ads everywhere. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the things that we've felt is that from an editorial exposure point of view for samples, at Maison Margiela and also now with Dries, I think what we are happy to be is sometimes the designer that people love, but as they have more and more pressure on them to feature advertisers in stories, editors will often have a call of one piece that they're passionate about or one designer that they love who isn't part of that political decision-making that's made through the prism of advertising. And for my ambition has always been to be the first on the list of the designers that they go to when they're free to choose for themselves. I'm not saying that everything is advertising based, but a lot is.
And your relations with the press, how do you do that? You told me earlier that maybe it's easier if you don't advertise.
Yeah, I mean, yes, because sometimes when you even buy one or two pages, people will say, well, you gave them the money and not us, so it's a choice. It becomes a choice. But, but I tend to do what I do in a sort of a rather old-fashioned way. I mean, I still go out for dinner and lunches, so it's very much that model, rather than, I often wonder how people who have got that might of advertising behind them, how they actually handle it. But it's something that's often done.
And last year you had you went through great lengths to help set up the exhibition of around Dries Van Noten, and you put a lot of effort in helping to contact galleries, photographers, and artists to have their work. And with a big result, you had like works of Damien Hirst, Picasso, so Rothko. So it was impressive. And why was it so important for Dries Van Noten? I
think we've spoken a lot today, the difference between a designer and an artistic director and whatever. I mean, Dries is, in all of the glorious sense of the term, a micromanager, and that he's somebody who's passionate about what he does and is involved in every step of that process. And sometimes I think when it gets back to message, and this is a word that we heard a lot today, this idea of DNA, and that we have to focus on our DNA. But sometimes we have to wonder when our DNA also becomes almost like an albatross around our neck. Because, for example, if Dries was to, people look on Dries and say it's about prince and ethnic. So if we're to focus on our DNA, that's all you do in a certain way, and that because that's what you're known for. But that's extremely reductive to a creative process. So the idea of the exhibition was also, because we had the invitation, and Paris is a city where Dries has invested so much in from the shows, and it's been a platform and a place of passion for him for a very long time, though he's based in Antwerp and very proud to be so. But you were really, but you wanted to open absolutely in Paris. Why is that? Well, because we knew it was coming to Antwerp after, but also Paris is the fashion capital that Dries, as a student, and many people as students decide to exist in. That's the mirror within which they've chosen to look at themselves as creative designers. And I felt also that, sometimes, and this is a thing that today is a little bit, we're speaking a lot about Antwerp today, and we're speaking a lot about being Belgian in fashion and creativity. But at the same time, we all know that an idea does not know any nationality, it doesn't know color, and it has nothing to do with borders. I mean, Dries's office is across the canal. The studio is full of Italians, Belgians, Americans, etc. I mean, the passport of the person who owns the company or who is the named designer isn't, Belgian fashion, okay, there's a point of view, but it's an international thing. In Ireland, for example, we're very proud of James Joyce as a writer, but we don't say he's an Irishman and a writer. We said he's a writer and an Irishman. So the thing with Dries as a designer, it's the fact that he had that opportunity. It's in Paris, which is the city of lights and arguably, and I agree, I think the world's fashion capital. The fact that he would have that position as a Belgian is extremely important, and I think that's where it was the right and fitting place for him to debut the exhibition.
And you think the label Belgian can be too limiting, or?
I think any nationality, it's not Belgian or Irish or German. I think people transcend, especially today, because we're dealing with a world platform. People are liking pictures that are bouncing around the place like on a global level. I think that there's something sort of parochial and a little bit regional, or maybe in saying that you have got particular thing as a Belgian designer. So often, for example, when it comes to Antwerp, Dries is invited again, even after 20 years or more, to say, Dries is Antwerp. So in a certain way, I think there are other people who can do that too. I think Dries could do it in his sleep at this point. Yeah. But I think people have now got to know Antwerp. It's not an oddity anymore that Antwerp is a regional place or a city. It's as people say today, it's a capital, and let's get on with just being good designers.
And the exhibition, lots of people saw it.
The exhibition, just to get back, the exhibition also was a way of showing that Dries's world is eclectic, which is an anti-DNA argument, because often people think it's just going to be about prints and ethnicity. There was that in it, but it also was an extremely wide proposal. It was about men and women. These are decoratif in Paris. There isn't that much men's fashion involved. It was also about the preciousness of the art, as well as how that inspiration. So I think, without it being patronizing or didactic, it was a way of people coming in and looking and say, okay, that's how a spark can happen, the Stowflace spark. You can look, it doesn't have to that if you see a picture done by Damien Hirst with butterflies, you have to take that literally, but that can be a starting point that brings you much further on. And I think it was a way of being generous and showing that these influences bombard a creative spirit from all different directions, and that can be a musician, that can be a painter, that can be... And today, to look at our industry as a creative field and just talk about fashion all the time, I think is old hat. I think we should we're creative people in a creative spirit, in that flow, and just move on with it.
And what was the impact of an exhibition, first in Antwerp and then first in Paris and then in Antwerp?
I mean, there's an institutional aspect to that. It was very, I think, it happened during Fashion Week, so it was a little bit dick and neck at the same time, but it worked really well. And people appreciated it. A lot of people in the creative field were very mesmerized by it, and also very touched by the fact that somebody would be as generous with their influences and their inspirations and their sources as he was. But also it was done with the right dose of Belgian humility at the same time.
If we look back at your time at Margiela, you started there and the budget for PR and marketing was limited, but still the brand managed to really build a strong brand. And can you give some key elements of this success? How did you do it?
It's very strange. I just prefix this by, in our industry, Martin retired. The company was sold, and a lot of people went to this place saying, oh, it'll never be the same, and this and whatever. People forget that when Martin was there designing the collections, they also didn't like things. Because now it's so sacramental that people forget that, in fact, I was there, so I know who didn't like what they didn't like. So they were very vociferous in saying, that was a crock, I didn't like it. So that's the first thing. I think also the thing about Margiela as well, I was extremely happy to be part of it because I didn't study fashion. I grew up in a sort of political family. For me, I really enjoyed the confidence and the passion which with Margiela wanted to be a bit rebellious. And I think that that's what's a little bit missing today when people analyze what that was. It was an image of an outfit, but yet Margiela was more about how the company behaved within an industry than just what the clothes were. And also, the wonderful thing about Margiela was an alchemy of two very, very singular spirits. There was Martin and Jenny was a conceptualist. She was the one who brought all of the behavioral aspect of what Margiela was around. And that was a really nice sort of trip to be on. And also, but yet at the same time, often, and this is something in all of our work, if we're too didactic, if we explain things too much, or if we tie up too much in little bows, we don't leave that space for people making their own interpretation. So in a certain way, Margiela allowed that happen with people, so that was good.
Do you have some examples you want to share of things like invitations and the venues for the shows was always...
Well, I think, by the way, what I was about to say there earlier is that the thing about Margiela is that it existed in a moment in time. It was provoking people, and at a time they were open to be provoked. Things have changed. Now, I think they're going back to where they were, but things became extremely, again, Cartesian and very sort of logicized and logical. So you had to have a show in the center of town. They weren't interested. For example, there was one invitation that Jenny did, which was a telephone number. You were sent a telephone number. You had to phone that number, and for a certain amount of time, the address was on an answering machine. Or an advertising put in the middle of the summer, in the middle of a newspaper. Things like that were... Because you wanted to show people that you had good ideas. It's a different thing. People were more open to being provoked, and people were happy to wear an idea. But then that sort of muted into what we now call luxury, which I think is, if there's one word I'd ban from our industry, was the word luxury, because I think it's got to the point it means nothing.
And why?
I think this is our own fault as an industry. I think we've jumped on that bandwagon and we've used it as an excuse to sell a lot of stuff that we don't really know why it exists, but we feel you should buy it.
Okay.
Sort of thing.
One thing that about Margiela, one last thing, is he being like invisible. And how was that as a communications person to work with that?
That's another thing that was quite interesting when the company was bought and the diesel people came in, because they're master marketeers. And it was quite interesting to see what we were doing through the prism, because this sounds falsely naive, and it isn't. We were complimenting somebody who just didn't want to do that aspect, wanted to focus on the clothing. But they saw it from the mysterious point of view. And for example, there's all this aspect of the invisible designer, but in fact it was more about the clothes being visible. At the time, people were doing profiles in a designer. It would be one-page picture of their head or portrait and a picture that big of the clothing. But if you remove the possibility for the portrait, that meant that page became the clothing. So that is a strategic choice, but it's also not just about, the mystery. And then afterwards, that muted into the Maison Martin Margiela, which was presenting it as some sort of fashion kibbutz, which it wasn't either, because at the same time, we all know that there's nothing less democratic than the creative process. I mean, there's clearly an artistic director, and there are people who are nourishing them or having that domain on their own, but it's one overall direction that people are happy to work in.
I know you don't want to be nostalgic or pessimistic, but when Raf Simons quit Dior, then a lot has been written about the infernal circle of fashion, and that's all going too fast, and that everything is wrong. How do you see that, the speed of fashion?
I don't know how many people here have seen that film, The True Cost. It's a documentary that's on iTunes, etc. I mean, I think that was a very interesting documentary. It was a little bit flawed towards the end, but one of the things I thought was a little bit too compact is that they put all the blame on fast fashion. They didn't incorporate our part of the industry, which I think we have our fair share of responsibility. I think that... sorry, what was the question? All has been written about the fashion cycle that's going too fast. That was why I brought up the true cost. I think it is too fast, but you know, at Dries, for example, Dries designs one collection a season.
Not pre-collections.
He doesn't have pre-collection, all the rest of it. And I joined Margiela autumn-winter 94, and that was a project that Jenny and Martin wanted to work on, which was about showing the clothes to the press, to the customers, to the shops at the same time when the clothes arrived in the season.
So not 6 months in advance.
Not 6 months before. And the thing about this fashion show thing is that one of the things about our industry is we have a reputation of being novel and new, whatever. We're most conservative, change-phobic industry that there is. And for me, a fashion show, yes, it's an interesting tool, but it's completely, it's an anachronism because we're showing, it was a professional moment to show clothes to professionals at a time when they could write about it and they could order it. But now we're completely confusing people showing it. But yet there's a huge resistance to change. And also the media, who criticizes us as an industry for that, are often the people who are most resistant to that change, frankly.
And do you think you can change it or not?
I mean, if you look at the jeans industry, they've got models of 3 weeks, etc. I mean, some of us aren't that, if you are making clothes, for example, Dries, if you're making fabrics in the way that we do, and you're using the techniques that we do, because our clothes are expensive, and that's one of the reasons, and people don't understand. Often, you can get a pair of jeans that are sequined from the waistline to the hem. They might cost you 50 euros, 500, 5,000, 50,000. People don't understand the difference anymore. Why that's more expensive. And the sad thing is that they just think it's branding. They think it's an empty concept. But the make, how things are done, where they're done, by whom, that matters. And so the fabrics, we cannot deliver clothes in the way that, for example, a jeans manufacturer can, because we have to pre-order the fabrics and work. 95% of Dries's fabrics are exclusive to him, so he starts the season developing the fabrics. So that's already something that can be done. So for us, I think we can maybe modulate it a little bit more and maybe design less or have less offer. That's something that we can look at. But if we want to invest, if Dries wants to invest his work with as much passion as he does, we're sort of a little bit stuck in that method.
I know you don't want to preach, but I have to ask you some advice for young designers. I know some are in the audience here. What would you say? Because a lot has changed since you started out in fashion. What kind of advice would you give them?
And again, this could be precisely this thing not to do. I think that you're a creative person. I think that today, clothing as a means of self-expression is less important. People are as happy to associate ideas or things that they see. I think fashion or clothing as an expression of creative output is amongst many others, music, lots of things. So my advice would be have fun with it and also challenge yourself out of the field, your immediate field of what you're doing. So it's not because you love making clothes that you shouldn't try and record music. Because let's face it, there are a lot of people in music, and the first thing they do is do a fashion collection. So in a certain way, I think fashion we should start singing more.
And do you have, like today we heard some messages, mixed messages, but you want to have a message of hope. What do you hope for the industry?
What did I say I'd hope for?
Well, the hope for the future. What do you want for the industry?
I think what I've just said is important. I also, I was very happy. Having done a stage at the Commission, I wanted to go back to Ireland and study law. I didn't. I was given this opportunity to work in the fashion industry, Belgian fashion. I loved the fact that it was showing a little bit of a two fingers to the industry. But I think also, when I came to Paris at that time, I found fashion to be like this family of what I would call the family of the fragile and the brittle.
Yes.
These were people who were so welcoming, and maybe they didn't have the confidence to be an artist or musician, whatever, but they were not artists, but they were craftspeople. But it was a real family with a great amount of energy and camaraderie and support. You'd go to parties, you'd bump into a Montana or a Rabanne or all these people. There was a lot of cross-pollination and people sharing a passion. What I would hope for is that And we're not alone in this. The fashion industry, every industry has people, we're using these phones to keep each other further apart. And I would just like that there would be a sense of family again. And that it's not because one company is having an after party with some big singer that they don't invite people working for other companies. Because what happens in Paris now is that if you work for one designer, the people who go to everything on the press, but we're left in our little ivory towers. And I think that if there's one thing I would wish for, whatever it is reach out, speak to people from other domains, push yourself out of your domain, and also have fun.
And don't play by the rules?
Oh, well, that sounds like, yeah. But I would just say, don't let the eunuchs take over the harem.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good conclusion, I think. Thank you very much, Mr. Scallon, for this nice conversation.
Thank you.